Today, the topic is China's economic outlook. Yesterday, Premier Li has talked about in the opening ceremony about China's economy. China's economy has entered into a phase of mid to high gear development. China's GDP has been very big right now. 1% of a growth means 1.5 or 5 years ago, or 2% of a growth 10 years ago. So the first round of the questions, I will start with Mr. Zhu Min. So I want to have his international perspective. So in the short term, within this year, what is China's economic growth rate? Or in 2 to 3 years' time, what is China's economic growth will be like? As for Mr. Fu, I have prepared a special question for you. So maybe we start with Zhu Min. I have noticed that in Q1, export seems to have been improved on the international level. So China's economic performance in Q1. So what are the evaluations, or what are people's different opinions, if there are? As I see it, on the whole, China's economy is very good. Internationally, the external political and the environment is improving, especially China-U.S. economic and trade relationship that has a huge influence on China-U.S. relations. Because as we recall, when Donald Trump came into office, there was a panic or kind of a fluctuation because there was the accusation of the trade war, etc. Right now, we are under the second phase, and the progression is very smooth. So bilateral relations between China and the United States is good. If we want to advance globalization, we must have China and the U.S. cooperation. People talk a lot about the U.S. President Donald Trump. When the new U.S. president came into office, always a lot of discussions, a lot of trade conflict. So at this time, when Donald Trump came into office, so that was the manipulation of the exchange rate accusation. But 6 months later, the relationship has become normal. I don't know. Donald Trump will do what kind of things later, but right now we can say that the external environment is good because we are on the healthy trajectory. Right now, China's economy will be stronger. U.S. economy will be stronger. The economy of U.S., Russia, and India will be good. So European economies will be stabilized. The global trade will be recovered, which is good news for China. 6 months ago, the export from China was strong. Another point is China's economy has undergone very profound structural changes. As we look at the figures from the first 6 months, the consumption percentage is very high, over 60%. So consumption has contributed significantly to China's economy. So employment, good, because there is the mass entrepreneurship and innovation. As for investment, it's prudent, it's stable and good. There are drivers such as the recovery of the trade and also stronger consumption. Just now, you also talk about next year. So I'm still very optimistic about China's economic performance next year. What do you mean by optimistic? Do you think that next year will be better than this year's performance? So This year, the economic growth rate will be around 6.7%. I think next year it will be close to this number or around this number. For China's structural adjustment has laid a solid and extensive foundation for China's economic performance. And starting right now, we have a big initiative, the Belt and Road Initiative. So it's not just something about financing or investment. It's a opening of the finance sector. So we will establish the financing network, the regulation networks, and also the training and the people exchange network. These will be strong foundation. And with this kind of a foundation, trade and investment will be improved very fast. So do you mean that Belt and Road Initiative will benefit countries along the road? And these countries will also drive China's economic performance, right? I think from trade, people flow, goods flow, I think they will all be good if we have just one route, which is just investment. I don't think it will achieve the scenario we have today. But right now, it's a 3D, three-dimensional strategy. We have training of the people. We have the policy coordination. So we can lower the risks of this Belt and Road Initiative, and that will attract more people. So in this sense, in the future 18 months, the economic growth prospect is very promising. So Professor Li, right now, I think many investment banks in foreign countries research about China's economy. It seems that in Q1, there was an opinion. China's economy has entered into a small cycle recovery because since the financial crisis, China's economic growth has dropped from over 10% 5 years ago and down all the way to 6%. And some even say that will be reduced to 5%. Some people were very pessimistic last year. But this year, especially in Q1, the number has jumped to 6.9%. I asked some investment banks about their research report. And they say at the very beginning of the year, the nominal GDP will be over 7%. The real GDP will be over 7%. But right now, that kind of opinion seems to have been forgotten. Maybe there are some new situations like the stock, etc. As you have worked in the central bank with the currency community and you have been following China's economy very closely, so what's your take on this? Well, the external or the foreign researchers look at China. I think, yes, they have their opinions, but I think the most reliable one is from IMF. So over the past 3 to 4 years, IMF's prediction about China's economic growth rate will be adjusted or be raised a little bit in the middle of this year. It's always like the situation. But if the foreign investment banks, they reduce the growth number. The investment banks, because they have to make money, they have to be objective. And I think the less reliable is the credit rating agencies, because they cannot catch or they get hold of the researchers from IMF IMF. I have never heard of this case. Some economist with IMF resigned the job from the agency and to work in investment bank. I don't think that has ever happened. And now we talk about the Chinese economy. I think the Chinese knows China's economy the best because we are in China. And also we have Caijing, and also we have different people. I think three factors come into China's macroeconomic. Of course, the first one is international factor, just as Zhu Ming said. So Donald Trump is a fast learner. Before he came into office, he always said that he would list China as the first target, as the currency exchange rate manipulator. But right now, when he comes into office, he changed his idea. Donald Trump knows how to make conversation, and he learns very fastly. When he met Chinese President Xi Jinping, so as President flew all the way to the United States, that's very different. As Donald Trump said, he claimed that he read a lot of books. But they are also saying that even his autography, he hasn't finished. So on the whole, the China's economic, the export grow by 8% and import grow by 15%. So that's the first factor. And the second, cyclical factors. For 52 consecutive months, the industrial shipment number was negative. That means a lot of enterprises face overcapacity. So when they reduce the prices, you have to think of ways to cut the overcapacity. So after 52 months of negative index, many enterprises exited the market. So 5% of the steel overcapacity was cut. Right now, the prices are up. The profits of businesses are up. And the third factor.
The third is particularly interesting, is the internal kind of institutional, political, and systematic changes taking place within China. There's a number of important, positive things that have been done recently. The public is also very supportive, and the media also covers these. That is, there are some kind of sticks in the mud in the bureaucracy that refuse to kind of cooperate with reforms or that are roadblocks on the way towards progress. So there is a major issue. There has historically been a major issue of kind of these sticks in the mud that have cut down on the pace of reform. Now we're seeing a new generation of leadership that is helping to bust up these roadblocks, that is cracking down on corruption. We see recently in Jiangsu province, an example, in you in the media, you should know. It was called a development conference, the Jiangsu Development Conference. This was a big deal. Caijing should have been paying attention. It's called the Jiangsu Development Project. Have you guys heard of this? Yeah. It's a big thing. And Jiangsu is the largest per capita GDP provinces in China, and they had a large conference dedicated to the achievement of the Xiaokang, moderately well-off society. So this year we're looking at 6.7, it's about the same as last year. Now, the financial markets are adjusting, so we might see a small decline. If there are no unexpected international events that disrupt markets, we'd expect 6.9% next year. Last Wednesday, the Tsinghua put out a report calling for 6.9, nearly 7. This, we believe, is a normal, natural rate of growth. But, of course, there are risks. And I would emphasize the global risks, especially Trump. Right now, Europe looks stable. France and Germany are now seem very much in solidarity for a united Europe. But Trump does pose risks. If there are domestic instability in the U.S., it could have an immediate effect on the stability of, say, Wall Street. Now, we know that Trump's executive team has a tremendous representation from Wall Street. There could be any political fallout from the drama there could directly impact Wall Street. We could see we know that the U.S. remains a big safe harbor. And Trump has made very clear he's dedicated to controlling immigration, especially with a focus on Mexico and Muslims, and internationally on U.S.-China trade and North Korea. But his actions speak louder than his campaigned words. He's very, very eager, very anxious to address the North Korea issue, to take action there. And so that can also lead to risks. Thank you. Well, this was a very political economic look. You really put the politics back in political economy. Now, I'd like to invite Madam Shih to share your views.
So we're coming from a foreign investment bank, and our outlook is very similar to Professor Lee for this year. We think that China is going to grow at 6.7%, but we think, on the contrary, next year it'll slow down to between 6 and 6.5%. I think China is still embarking on a road of deleveraging. But I think what China wants is a stable environment, at the same time growing. So I think China is stepping on the gas in some place and stepping on the brake in some places. So deleveraging, but whenever the economy slows down to a certain level, I think that the policies will again become more accommodative. I think what China obviously is working on is the 270% debt to GDP ratio. And we think that that will need a lot of accommodative, at the same time, measures on deleveraging. So I think it's a balancing act there.
OK. 好像是我觉得
Well, I have seen many years of investment banks' reports on economic growth. And they generally seek to publish a level and then adjust it, usually up. Song Guoqing is a domestic scholar. And we have commented on some of the accuracy and inaccuracy of these reports. So, Mr. Fu, maybe you jump in here to talk about, from the industry's perspective, the outlook of the economy. I gotta be honest, I don't think what you're talking about is really that relevant. Why do I say that? China's problem is not how much its GDP grows. The issue is the efficacy and quality of that growth. So if you say China needs to grow 7%, fine, we'll get 7%. Is that important? No. Employment, risk management, economic transition, 6%, that would be great. You were saying if we could do 6.9%, what does that mean? As Premier Li said yesterday, 6.9% today is 9% 5 years ago. But we still have a lot of quality issues, particularly in the real economy and in heavy industry and manufacturing. There still is a lot of economic transformation that has to take place. The rise of the services sector. It's gone from 51.6 to 56% of the economy. This is a positive trend. But we can't blindly follow the numbers that are thrown out by foreign and domestic experts and say that the numbers themselves are the goal. So I have to kind of disagree with something that you've mentioned, in that you say international risk, global risk is the biggest risk to us. I'd say the last couple of years, global trade has not improved. It's about 0% growth. But China's internal reforms, internal restructuring, has been critical to our economy over the last several years. So I would emphasize internal reform and restructuring. This is what needs to be properly managed. Because if we can't properly manage it, then this ongoing growth will be a problem. Well, allow me to jump in here and comment. These two are minister-level officials. You guys can talk about what we should do, what we shouldn't do. This is good, that's bad. The two of us over here, we are scholars and bankers. We can just speculate about what will happen, what might happen. We speculate, and they lead. This is like our perspectives are like passengers and pilots in an airplane. We're along for the ride. You're driving the plane. Well, I assure you that the leadership and the managerial class very much appreciates the academic resources and evidence, statistics that you provide us. So if you're asking, I'm just asking for us to slow down the plane a little bit. Let's do this right. Okay. Now, all of us up here, we like to discuss a couple of questions, but we also want to leave 20 minutes for Q&A with the crowd. So please, everyone think if there are comments that you particularly want to make, we'll give the opportunity to open it up in a bit. Now, just now, Mr. Fu mentioned that numbers are numbers, but behind the numbers, China is entering a new phase. We talked about, almost 6. But over the medium and long term, China's reform, will it be able to continue to power a kind of economic reform bonus? Will it be able to improve the quality, not just quantity of growth? Premier Li said that he wanted to reduce bureaucracy and decentralize power, decentralize decision-making as part of the reforms. I'd like to hear, in your view, reform, these measures, what reforms will be able to unleash the dynamism of the Chinese economy moving forward? Don't give us three. Just give us one. One major reform is going to be allowing the market to play a decisive role. That's going to have an immediate impact on GDP. It's also going to have an immediate impact on growth. Over the past 30 years, all of our experience tells us that a sufficient competition in a market mechanism is going to unleash more efficiency. So we need to maintain that path and deepen that reform. Now, where do you see parts of the economy that are not market mechanisms that need marketization? Well, I would want to say three if you make me name them. Well, primarily you talked about reducing bureaucracy and decentralizing decision-making. It's very important. So that would reduce the barriers to entry. But, of course, the things that need to be regulated should be regulated. And there needs to be coordination and information sharing and a greater market mechanism for balancing the need for market and regulation. So that's very important. Second, we speak a lot about the fourth industrial revolution and artificial intelligence. So promoting entrepreneurship, innovation, the enthusiasm for these changes is important. Finding a balance between industrial planning and opening the creativity and imagination of the market while maintaining transparency and also offering appropriate fiscal support. So finding market mechanisms for cultivating the economy of the future. Third, well, I want to interrupt in a second. You mentioned kind of a fair mechanism for distributing resources across the market. So that's to say not to discriminate between big companies, small companies, state-owned, privately owned, different individuals versus corporates, not allocating resources, whether those are fiscal or lending resources, to a particular, to picking winners. Third is what Kathryn mentioned, is reducing industrial capacity and leverage. Right now, growth is decelerating, but risk is increasing in capacity. We reduced 300 million 300 million tons of coal capacity and 80 million tons of steel capacity last year. But we need to continue to use market mechanisms to see a healthy consolidation to eliminate smaller players, bankruptcy through acquisition and consolidation, and use a market mechanism for that consolidation. Now, that's all I'll say here.
Professor Li, well said. The principles, I completely agree. I would like to talk about two things. So, as Mr. Fu, expert, SOE, boss, the principles are there. But during the two sessions of this year, as the delegate of the NPC session, Mr. Fu talked about the SOE reform. I think maybe we can ask Mr. Fu later talk about the SOE reform. And this topic, the principles have been talked for many years. Actually, it started since the late 1980s, how to implement these programs, especially in those northeast region where the economy is more challenged. have so many enterprises in northeast of China. We need some role models. We need some reference cases. But right now, we lack these examples. We have some pace setters, but when they appear on the CCTV news, they are already gone, like the 1,000 people talent plan. So in the military sector, this person actually has died. We want to see a live person. For instance, like in the 1980s, the Shougang and Yanshan petrochemical, they were the role models of the time. Right now, we need some role models. And also, in the local government, there are some distortions because they're driven by finance. So the land revenue is an issue. And also, some local governments don't want to delegate powers because they know when they let the power go, they cannot collect money. They need to find a way to make money. Do you have any solutions? Yes. For instance, we encourage local government to hold assets for longer term. For instance, without the local SOEs, they can hold on to some real estate because these examples can be found in Singapore. For instance, these properties can be rented to people who have the needs. When the market is more mature, I can let them go public. There are multiple ways. Right now, selling land, doing the infrastructure, lend money from banks. Then what do? They lend money from SOE. As SOE, after they get in loan from the banks in the form of PPP, private-public partnership, they work together with the local government. So I think that's the core reason why we have such a high leverage ratio. The corporate debt situation has improved. Right now, the EBITDA divided by the dividends, right now, this number is 3.5% higher than that of the United States. So I think this medium is higher than that of the United States. So we just can't afford to have the empty talk about deleverage. We have to implement measures, put measures in place, for instance, to find them ways or method to make money. So basically, your idea is that actually for the money you collected at the different localities by the central government can be returned to the local government. So if the circulation cycle is very long, lots of problems arise. I think in this whole loop of the circulation, a lot of things can be done.
Urgent, pressing.
Well, I
reform.
think Dr. Zhu and Professor Li already gave excellent answers to that. The only thing I can add to that, I think, is we need to develop the capital markets for China. I think it's a good way to take the NPLs out of the banks and the system and create securities or assets, asset funds to distribute that. And in general, a lot of the savings in China is still in cash.
Yes.
So if we can create a more robust capital market and create more products that are healthy, that are more international in standard for investors to invest in, I think a lot more of the money will go back into the system.
To mobilize more savings.
Exactly,
from
to mobilize the
system.
savings by creating a more robust capital market so that it goes back into industry, into supporting the growth of the economy.
OK. 我回来再问你们俩一个问题啊，这个。
A question back to you, still about the streamlining of administration and delegation of power. In the summer Davos in Dalian, has talked about the streamlining of administration and delegation of powers 2 years ago. So 2 years ago, Premier Li said the streamlining of the administration and delegation of power said that. So 60% of the administrative approved power was delegated. But right now, I found that maybe this percentage was a result of the administrative rights at the NDRC. For instance, 200 programs had to be approved by NDRC, maybe, so the number has been reduced by 70 or 60%. So this kind of a figure may not reflect the real situation. So administrative approval power are still in the hands of the government. What do you think of it? Actually, there are two levels. So one is on the central government, and the other is on the local government. So the central government's streamlining administration is very aggressive, just by thousands and thousands of them, from the finance, taxation, oversight, regulation, and registration of corporate, etc. But many of the business activities are in different localities. So local government, whether they will streamline administration. So some people say the streamlining and the delegation is not enough because the central government does that, but the local governments don't do. Oh, it won't work. Right now, we have communication with the business and economic community. Premier Li Keqiang said that when we talk about streamlining administration and delegation of power, we do not focus purely on the number. We focus on the quality. For instance, the custom clearance speed is very slow. So can we improve the speed of customs clearance, reach the level of that of European and the United States? If we can do that, we not only streamline the administration and delegation of power, we also improve the quality and the efficacy. This morning, we also talked about this situation during the breakfast with many CEOs. Many people said that right now, in China, you open trade, but the custom clearance time is way too long. I think that's a big change. So from the pure emphasis to numbers to the emphasis on the final result, I think that is very good. So Professor Li, I think that's a very fundamental question. We ask an academic question. So next year, the 40th anniversary of China's reform and opening up. So things that the foreigners don't understand. For instance, exchange rate, etc., they all know about it because they are transparent. So what are the things that foreigners don't understand? I think it's the local government, especially the county level. There are many change of behaviors. Before the reform and opening up, that was very bureaucratic. Since reform and opening up, as the economy grows better and faster, the local officials become like the chairman of a holding company. So they can solve problems for enterprises. For instance, Sinopec want to make an investment, and you cannot get the evaluation permit. Then it's just like I can ask Sinopec to get the certificate for me. I mean, that's a metaphor. So how can we do that? And many enterprises do not want to do that. So since you have mentioned the streamlining of the administration and delegation of the powers, if they cannot get the evaluation of the environmental impact perfect, if something goes wrong, so who will be held accountable. I think that is crucial. How to motivate the local officials. I'm not saying that mobilizing the local officials. I'm talking about how to make local officials to delegate power. I think foreigners don't understand. So we can comparing Chinese officials with officials in India, Pakistan, and Russia. So Indian officials speak blah, 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 while Chinese officials, they do things for you. They take the initiative to break down some power limits. For instance, I think, Mr. Fu, I think your project come this way, right? I think the minister level, Mr. Fu, do you think I'm right? Do you think I'm reasonable? Mr. Fu, I have to correct Professor Li. He always say that I'm a minister. I think this is misguiding because we are SOE. We have to attend some meetings. There is the level of the treatment. When I retire, I'm a public servant, so my treatment or the benefit I get will be much lower when I work in this position. So last question, I think it's a very serious question. Right now, we look at reform and opening up. Professor Li has mentioned that the SOE reform started since the late 1980s, from the complete ownership to the market-based mechanism. So after 30 plus years of reform of the SOE, the reform has touched upon many stakeholders, including private economy. So right now, what is the status quo of the reform of SOE? What are the things that are reformed? What's their purpose? To improve corporate governance? To improve the economic performance of the SOEs? So what are the purposes of the SOE reform? So I would like to ask you this question because I'm always confused. Let me put it this way. Still, I go back to Professor Li because I'm not a government official. I cannot say things that are supposed to be said by government officials. This is just my personal observation. So within the system, I have been managing SOE for so many years. Just now, we have mentioned it's almost 40 years of the reform. So our reform has very been successful. All of a sudden, I feel confused. Why? If the reform was not successful, how could China become the world's second largest economy? When I was in the United States, I was wondering whether China would be able to have a high-speed railway in 100 years of time. So that was a question asked by myself many years ago. But right now, what has happened has proven that the reform is correct. But right now, reform in many aspects has stalled or even reversed. So that's why people feel confused. So we have been so smooth in the past on the trajectory of reform. Why the stop? Why the suspension? So right now people ask the question, what is the purpose of the reform?
Shouldn't the companies themselves achieve that international competitiveness, that sustainability? And how do nations achieve their national or international competitiveness? Now, if we are the socialism with special Chinese characteristics as led by the Chinese Communist Party, how do we establish competitiveness? How do we, on all of these planes, continue to improve our comparative advantages? We have a system, and it has its pros and cons, and how do we minimize its drawbacks and continue to optimize and refine its advantages. And of course, the leadership of any country, and certainly the Communist Party leadership, has to think about how to address the needs of its people while also maintaining vital, robust economic growth. So when we speak about reform, we need to think about what the goals are and on what planes those reforms have to take place. So if we speak about state-owned enterprise reform, we have to be very clear about what our goals are. If I speak from a national perspective, where do we want to be in 30, 32 years? What goals are we setting for our state-owned, publicly owned companies? What goals are we setting for our private sector? And so being clear about our direction and being goals-oriented in our strategy is very critical. Our reform may need two levels. The first level is national reform. Just now, Mr. Zhu mentioned that if we don't have national institutional reform, there is no reform for SOEs. Because the companies exist in the market. We are defined by the ecosystem. If the state decentralizes decision-making and deepens those reforms, that changes the ecosystem in which we can reform. So Premier Li has emphasized the most important reform in these years has been the reduction of bureaucracy and decentralization of decision-making authority. Now, in terms of employment, registration is now very easy. Entrepreneurship and innovation is getting more and more streamlined, less and less red tape. Now many procedures that required government approval no longer require it. Now, when you decentralize that power, we see a number of things happen. One is that local authorities simply don't have the capacity to govern. They are either unable or unwilling to exercise those powers that are being newly vested in them. So this requires the staffing and management departments of our bureaucracy to adapt to this new system. We think back to what China was, what its system was before we were the second largest economy in the world. And as we grew economically, there was a lot of adaptation that had to take place. We've been going through a number of rapid transformations, and now on the edge of the fourth industrial revolution, we are faced with a much greater, much faster acceleration of transformation. And thirdly, this setting up smart systems, smart institutions, smart governments. It's challenging. It requires government to deepen its own reforms. If government can't reform its own systems and institutions and balance the relationship between social and economic needs, then it is very difficult or almost impossible for state-owned enterprises to reform. So, for example, the three smarts, three SOE reforms that have been called for in the state-owned sector, many of them are blocked by bottlenecks in government or institutional reform. So if the government doesn't reform, the market can't follow, and the market entities are going to be unable to reform. So two areas of reform for the government. One is allowing the market to play a decisive role in the allocation of resources, and second, as power is decentralized, providing sufficient support and service to those decision-making bodies. Especially as the economy is made up of a more diverse range of small and medium enterprises, and the services and support that they will need to go through this decentralized bureaucracy requires further reforms from the government. So if you want to see the future of SOE reform, don't look to the SOEs, look to the government. Are they doing making very meaningful changes, or very superficial ones? I promise that when the government concludes its reforms, the SOEs will be right with them. Okay. Well, we have such a short period of time, but we have spoken with such depth about where the economy is and where it's going, what the goals and directions are. Now I'd like to take whatever time is left and offer it to our audience. And please introduce yourselves. Thank you, Mr. Wang. I'm Tianwei. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. I'd like to ask, just now, Mr. Zhu mentioned AI. And we've been speaking about a lot of that. And there are concerns about a bubble. In January of this year, a report on global risks talked about AI and some of the risks that might be there to an AI killing. For example, if AI is used in weaponry, killing one person and killing many people is a very minor issue. Okay, so look, when we talk about risk, we look at short-term and long-term risk. So longer time risk is changing the relationship between men and machines, between social norms, between how we view and interact with technology, employment. Those are all long-term things. Now, in the short term, we do have impacts on labor and education. The truth is that AI is already taking place in a number of fields, in drones, for example, and in the equipment and gear that soldiers are armed with. So one question is, like, in the future, do we even need soldiers? Could we simply have, autonomous soldiers? Now, of course, another, very big issue is cybersecurity. With all of the developments we expect to see in the future come from computing and big data. If you can take control of those computers, all of that data, all of the avionics and the transport and the infrastructure will be vulnerable. So that's a technical challenge, and it's also a global governance issue. Finance, digital finance, is now borderless. How does this impact money laundering? How does it impact international crime? Who will be responsible for regulating these issues? So these are all potential risks. So we need new global governance structures to answer these questions. It cannot be on a country-by-country basis. It has to be an international effort. And that's something that is currently quite lacking. And now with the U.S. retreating from multilateralism, that is becoming a barrier to progress in building these consensuses. But the international community wants a multilateral approach to creating better governance structures and containing these risks. Next question. The gentleman in the back, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Kumai, and the discussion was very informative. And I recognize that.
Could you sort of stand up? I mean, so we can see you.
I recognize that your outlooks are basically optimistic. And my question is that what is the biggest risk factor of the Chinese economy? What is the tail risk of the economy? And I'd like to ask each panelist to point out one risk factor in 10 or 20 seconds.
In 20 seconds, wow. But that would take but if everybody answers the same question, it would take another hour. And he wants to replace your role, become the moderator.
No, he
can ask everybody to name one the risk factor for Chinese economy.
特别，
就是中国主要的风险因素是什么？
我不说了，刚刚也说过了。我刚刚已。
Well, as I said it, it's Trump. But Trump and the world economy and the Chinese economy are irretractably linked. And this young lady here. And please ask something specific. No big essays. Hi, I'm Yang Yuan from the Financial Times. Mr. Fu just mentioned the issue of that economic growth statistics are boring. I agree. So I want to ask, why is the Chinese government still that focused on economic growth statistics? How do we kick this addiction to GDP statistics? This is not the Chinese government's addiction. That's not the issue. One is an issue of confidence to the Chinese and world economy. If we put out these numbers like 8 and then 7 and then 6, it creates a crisis of confidence in terms of market participants that are basing decisions based on trends. So that's one aspect. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Second, there is the issue of the reality of economic kind of trends, and the truth is that we are more or less balanced, or more or less where we should be in terms of the speed of growth. We're on a very normal track. The progress we're making is really showing primarily in the quality of growth, not necessarily in the speed. And this year, we've also focused on an employment strategy, what the government calls an employment strategy, which is using employment as a lever to achieve sustainable, stable growth in the economy. As long as there's employment, there's tax revenues, there are companies, there's spending, there's consumption, and so we need new momentum. The high-tech sector, of course, is not the dominant sector of the economy, but it provides a lot of, fuel for the engine. And third, I would say, a very important factor is that the energy intensity of GDP is drastically decreasing. So that is very, very important. I very much agree with what they've been doing here. The economy won't grow any slower than it is, or too much slower. I hope that it doesn't grow much faster, because I want to focus on the quality of that growth, not the speed. I'm sorry, everybody. We've run out of time. I think our Japanese friend over there had mentioned what an informative discussion this was. I very much agree. Let's give a great round of applause to our guests.